Walk with me, not in a wagon. On foot, the way they actually did it, because the wagons were too heavy and too violent to ride in for more than a few miles at a time. Walk with me along the ruts carved so deep into the earth by 400,000 wagon wheels that you can still find them today, pressed into the rock in the soil of Wyoming and Nebraska like a scar the continent never healed from. Every 100 meters of this walk, you are standing on top of someone, not metaphorically. Literally, the bodies are beneath the path. They were buried in it, under it, beside it, in holes scraped out of ground, so hard it took the strength of 2 men and most an hour to reach a depth that the wolves would not immediately undo. The Oregon Trail is not a historical route. It is a 2,000-mile cemetery that nobody ever finished building. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today we are walking the real Oregon Trail. You're going to discover why the most lethal thing on that trail had no weapon and no face and no sound. Why the families who survived the journey arrive in Oregon carrying a specific kind of grief that no amount of new land or new beginning could address. And why some of the worst decisions a parent ever made were not decisions at all, but simply the only options remaining when the mathematics of survival had reduced the choices to one. The image in the school book is a painting. It is always a painting, warm-toned and horizontal. The covered wagon rolling through golden afternoon light with a family arranged inside it in attitudes of hopeful contemplation. Children press against the canvas, looking out at the landscape of their future. The artist was not lying about the wagon. The wagon was real. The Conestoga, the prairie schooner, the various configurations of wood and canvas and iron that carried the material possessions of immigrant families across the continent. These were real objects making a real journey. What the painting got wrong was the people inside the wagon, because the people were not inside the wagon. The wagon weighed 1.5 tons when loaded. It had no suspension. The wheels were wooden, iron-rimmed, designed to roll over terrain that the concept of smoothness had never been applied to, transferring every rock and rut and irregularity of the trail directly through a frame and into bed with a violence that made continuous occupancy not merely uncomfortable, but physically unsustainable. You rode in the wagon when you were sick or injured or too young to walk. Otherwise, you walked every day for 2,000 miles alongside the wagon in the dust it raised, breathing what the oxygen had you left in the air, feeling the sun on the same side of your face for weeks because the trail ran west and the sun tracked south, and there was nothing you could do about either. The families that set out from Independence, Missouri in the spring migration season of the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s understood, in the way that people understand things they have been told but not yet experienced, that the journey would be difficult. The emigrant guides they had purchased back east describe hardship in the generic terms of challenge to be overcome by determination. What the guides did not describe, because their authors had commercial reasons to emphasize the destination over the route, was a specific biological catastrophe waiting in the water. Approximately 10% of everyone who attempted the Oregon Trail did not finish it. That fraction, distributed across the hundreds of thousands of people who made the journey in its peak decades, produces a number of dead that is not abstract. It is a number that requires a landscape to contain it, and the landscape that contained it was a trail itself for 2,000 miles. The cause of death that dominated that number was not the threat that the emigrant's imagination had prepared for. It was not the confrontation with indigenous peoples that the dime novels had made central to the frontier narrative. It was not starvation or predator attack or the dramatic accidents that occasionally produce a single death. It was cholera, and cholera was in the water, and the water was everywhere and unavoidable and necessary for survival, and there was no way to know, looking at it, what it contained. The bacterium responsible, Vibrio cholerae, requires a specific set of conditions to produce the outcome it produced on the trail in such numbers, a large population of humans in close proximity, a water supply contaminated by human waste, and the absence of any effective treatment for the infection once it was established. The Oregon Trail provided all three with consistency that made epidemic not a risk, but a recurring feature of every migration season. Thousands of people, thousands of animals, moving along the same corridor, camping at the same water sources, drawing from the same streams and springs and shallow pools that collected in the depressions along the route. Everything that the people and animals upstream deposited in or near those water sources traveled downstream to where the people below them were drinking. The trail was not a line through wilderness. It was a corridor of human occupation, moving westward through the season, and every mile that was downstream from every mile behind it. The speed of cholera is a detail that the historical record returns to with particular emphasis of people who witnessed it and could not reconcile it with their prior understanding of how illness worked. A person who was healthy enough to harness the oxen in the gray light before sunrise could be beyond help by the time the same sun set. The sequence was brutal in its efficiency. The diarrhea arrived first, not the gradual loosening of a digestive system processing something disagreeable, but an explosive and continuous evacuation that the body could not pause or control. The vomiting accompanied it. The body was emptying itself of fluid from every available exit simultaneously, at a rate that exceeded the capacity of any amount of drinking to compensate. The fluid loss was a mechanism of death, and it was visible in real time to everyone watching. The skin of a person in the advanced stages of cholera dehydration changes in ways that those who witness it described as watching someone age decades in an afternoon. The tissue beneath the skin loses a turgor that gives a living face its familiar architecture. The cheeks hollow. The skin along the hands and forearms draws tight and wrinkles in patterns that belong to extreme old age, not to the young men and women and children who were exhibiting them. The lips drew back. The color moved from the flush of fever through gray and towards something with blue in it. The color of circulation failing at the periphery as the blood thickened and the heart struggled to move it. A child who had been running alongside the wagon in the morning could be unrecognizable by evening, not metaphorically unrecognizable, physiologically altered to a degree that the faces of the people who loved them had to work to find the familiar features in. And by midnight, if the trajectory continued to its conclusion, that child was rigid, and the family had a decision to make before the sun came up and the trail continued without them. The decision about burial on the Oregon Trail was not made in a context that allowed for the deliberate grief and structured ritual that death in a stable community makes possible. It was made under the pressure of a schedule that had no room for sentiment, imposed not by any human authority, but by the physics of the mountain passes that waited at the western end of the journey. The Sierra Nevada and the Blue Mountains had windows, specific, non-negotiable seasonal windows during which the passes were navigable by wagon, measured in weeks rather than months, and the cost of arriving at those windows too late had been paid by the Donner Party in a currency that every subsequent emigrant understood completely. Every day spent stopped on the trail was a day's credit drawn against that window. The family that stopped to conduct a proper burial, to grieve fully, to sit with their dead in the way that grief actually requires, was gambling the lives of everyone still living against completion, a ceremony that the dead no longer needed. They dug what they could dig in the time they had. The ground along the trail was not uniform in its resistance, but the ground that people remember from the accounts, the hard-packed alkaline soil of the high desert stretches, the rocky substrate of the mountain approaches, did not yield to a shovel in the way that loam yields. 60 centimeters was a depth that many accounts described, scratched and pried from the resistant earth by people who had been walking for weeks and eating inadequately and watching someone they loved dissolve over the course of a single day. 60 centimeters is not a grave in the sense that the word implies containment and permanence. It is a shallow depression in the earth covered by a coarse wool blanket and whatever stones the immediate vicinity offered. The wagon moved on. It had to move on. The people remaining in it and walking alongside it understood, with a clarity that did not require discussion, what would happen when the caravan disappeared over the next rise and the trail fell quiet behind them. They had seen the wolf sign along the route. They had heard the coyotes at night, with a particular attentiveness of people who now had a specific and terrible reason to notice. The soil they had placed over blanket was loose. It was a loose soil of a recently disturbed surface, and loose soil in a landscape inhabited by animals that hunt by scent and are entirely without sentiment about the source of available nutrition is not a barrier. It is an announcement. There are accounts from emigrants who look back, who turn on the seat of the wagon or stopped walking, and looked back at the mound diminishing with distance, and kept looking until the trail's next curve or rise took out of sight. The accounts do not dwell on what they thought about in those moments. They do not need to. The looking back is a record. The act of continuing to turn and look until the last possible moment before the trail took the view away is all the testimony required. The wolves were not the only danger that the trail produced in proximity to the wagon wheels. The wheels themselves were a source of death that the immigrant literature had not prepared families for, because it was a kind of death that emerges from the specific geometry of journey that everyone understood in the abstract and almost no one had taken before. The wagon wheels were wooden and iron-rimmed and measured approximately 5 feet in diameter. The wagons they supported, fully loaded with the furniture and tools and provisions and material aspirations of a family attempting to transplant an entire domestic existence across a continent, weighed between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds. The oxen drawing them were large and slow and responded to commands with the interpretive latitude of animals that were tired and hot and working at the edge of their physical capacity. When an instruction was given to stop, the stop was not immediate. It was a gradual deceleration measured in seconds and in the feet of trail that passed beneath the wheels before the mass of the wagon, and its load could be brought to rest. Children walked alongside the wagon. They walked alongside it for 2,000 miles every day because the interior was too violent for continuous occupancy, and because children require movement, and because the trail offered no other place to put them. They walked alongside the wheel. The wheel that stood 5 feet tall and was backed by 2,000 pounds of loaded wagon, pulled by a team of oxen that would require several seconds and several feet to stop once the driver realized that something had gone wrong at ground level. Exhaustion on the trail was not the tiredness of a day's normal activity. It was a cumulative depletion of weeks of walking in heat and dust, eating reduced rations, sleeping on hard ground under conditions of sustained anxiety, the body's reserves drawn down to a level at which the normal mechanisms that keep a person upright and alert were operating on a reduced budget. A child who had walked 15 miles that day, who had not slept adequately the night before, who had eaten inadequately at the meal before walking, did not fall with the deliberate, controlled descent of someone choosing to sit down. They fell the way exhausted bodies fall without warning, without the reflexive protection that a fully alert nervous system provides, down and sideways into the path of what was rolling beside them. The driver's reaction time, the oxen's responsive command, the distance the wheel required to stop after the process of stopping had begun. These intervals, measured in fractions of seconds and in inches of travel, were the variables that determined whether a child who fell beside the trail got up again. The accounts that describe the outcomes when those variables did not resolve favorably are brief in a way that the most devastating events in personal records are sometimes brief. The writer's capacity for extended description overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they are trying to record. A line, sometimes less than a line, the compression of an irreversible moment into the minimum language required to acknowledge that it happened. The wagon continued. There was nothing to be done that would change what had already occurred, and the trail did not pause for any of it. The Oregon Trail was not a passage through hardship toward a promised destination. It was a continuous transaction in which the price of arrival was paid in the people and the pieces of people who did not complete the journey. Every family that reached Oregon or California carried with them an arithmetic of loss that varied in its specifics and was uniform in its weight. The graves behind them, shallow and inadequate and compromised by the first night's wildlife, were not waypoints on a journey that had succeeded. They were permanent installations in a 2,000-mile memorial that nobody planned and everybody contributed to. The West was not waiting to be settled. It was waiting to be paid for. And the currency accepted was a particular kind of suffering that the trail extracted from the people who attempted it, in the specific denominations of a child's skull against an iron wheel rim, a father's hands on a shovel in ground too hard to dig properly, a family's back turned on a mound they could not afford to stay beside, and the sound of what they already knew was coming, fading into the distance behind them as the oxen pulled the wagon forward and the trail continued west. What would hollow you out more completely? The cholera's clock, 18 hours from healthy to gone, the body of someone you know becoming something unrecognizable in the time between one's sunrise and the next, or the shallow grave, the loose soil, the wolves you can already hear, and the fact that the wagon has to move before the sun is fully up, and you cannot be there to prevent what you already know is coming. There is no good answer, and you know it. Tell us anyway, in the comments. And if you believe that reaching a frontier town at the end of that trail meant the worst was behind you, the medicine waiting in those settlements deserves your attention before you conclude anything. The bottles on the general store shelf, the physicians in their blood-stiffened coats, the chair in the blacksmith shop, all of it was waiting for the survivors of the trail with particular and patient lethality. Click on our video about the toxic reality of frontier medicine. What was available to keep you alive on the frontier was sometimes more dangerous than what was trying to kill you. Raw, visceral, history. This is a raw frontier.